What would you do if the man you built an empire with chose someone else when bullets started flying? Elena Whitmore stood in the burning corridor of her own home, 8 months pregnant, while her husband's men ran past her, straight toward his mistress. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She pressed her back against the wall, covered her stomach with both arms, and watched the man she had loved since before he was dangerous make the worst decision of his life. Damian Voss had survived 17 years in organized crime, but surviving the look on Elena's face that night, that was a different kind of war. If this story grips you, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The night the Voss compound burned, it started the way most disasters do, quietly. The perimeter lights went dark at 11:42. Not all at once. One by one, the way candles get snuffed by a deliberate hand moving down a row. The head of security, a thick-necked man named Ruiz, noticed it on the monitor bank and radioed the east gate before the static ate his signal. He tried again. Nothing came back. He was reaching for the hardline phone when the first explosion punched through the outer wall like a fist through drywall, and after that, there was no more reaching for anything. Ruiz was airborne for a half second before the corridor wall ended his momentum. Inside the main house, Damian Voss heard the blast from the third floor. He was already awake. He'd been awake since 9, sitting at the long mahogany table in his private office, with 3 manila folders spread open in front of him and a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. He'd been trying to read the same page of financial routing documents for 20 minutes, because something in his chest had been sitting wrong all evening. A specific kind of wrongness he had learned to pay attention to over the course of a career that left bodies behind it like breadcrumbs. When the wall shook and the light stuttered, Damian was already on his feet. He moved to the window first. Across the east courtyard, past the fountain and the iron gates his father had installed in 1987, he could see orange light spreading low along the ground. Not the clean orange of a security flare. The dirty, hungry orange of something that wasn't planned. He watched it for maybe 4 seconds, just long enough to understand the shape of what was happening. Then he turned away from the window and pressed the button on the underside of his desk that armed the panic protocol. The compound had 4 designated safe points. He'd walked the route with his security team twice a year, every year, since he'd taken ownership of the property. He knew the distances by muscle memory. North basement shelter, 63 steps from his office door. South garage, 112 steps through the servant corridor. East bunker, compromised as of approximately 40 seconds ago. West exit, through the family wing. He was already moving toward the door when his phone rang. Marcus, his second in command, calling from somewhere that sounded like the inside of a car. "We're breached," Marcus said. No greeting, no preamble. That was the thing about Marcus. In a crisis, the man became surgical. East and south simultaneously, minimum 12 hostiles, probably more. Vehicles at the outer gate. Who? Thinking Carrera's people. The timing matches the move we've been waiting for. Ruiz. A pause that said enough. Damian pulled the secondary pistol from the drawer safe and racked the slide. "Get your team to the main house. Priority is already moving. Boss." Another pause, this one different, waited. "Celeste is in the East Wing guest suite. Suite 12. I know where she is. She's been calling the house line. I said I know." He ended the call. He stood in the center of his office for exactly 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Celeste Marlowe was in Suite 12 because she'd arrived 3 days ago from the city at his invitation, which Elena did not know about, which was the kind of thing that in another life might be called a detail, but in this life was something considerably heavier. Celeste had her own car, her own people, theoretically her own ability to handle herself. But Suite 12 sat adjacent to the East Wing, and the East Wing was where the wall had just been blown in. The family wing was on the west side of the house, where Elena was sleeping, 8 months pregnant as of last Tuesday. Damian moved into the hallway and started toward the west staircase. He got as far as the second landing before his earpiece crackled with the voice of Torres, one of his floor team. "Mr. Voss, We have confirmation of hostiles inside the east corridor, first floor. They're moving toward the center of the house. We need to establish a containment line. Where's my wife? Static. Then, West Wing is secure, sir. We have 2 men on Mrs. Voss's position. 2. Yes, sir. Get me 4. Get me 4 right now and tell them nobody moves her until I'm there. Copy, sir. Miss Marlowe's position is... I know her position. He was 3 steps from the bottom of the west staircase when he heard Celeste's voice, not from the radio, from down the corridor to his right, where she was standing in a silk robe with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her face arranged in the specific expression of panic that she deployed when she needed something done immediately. Damian. Her voice was controlled, but the word came out like a hand gripping his sleeve. There are people in the hallway outside my suite. I could hear them through the wall. I didn't know where... How did you get here? I ran. She looked at the gun in his hand. Something moved through her expression. Not fear, exactly. You need to get me out. I need to get my wife out. The words landed in the corridor between them and just sat there. Celeste's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. I understand that. I'm asking you to get us both out. You have 2 legs and a clear path to the south garage. The south is compromised. You know that. Then take 2 men from my... Damian. Her voice dropped, became something private, something that carried all the weight of 8 months of arrangement and understanding and all the things that happened in rooms that Elena had no access to. Don't leave me here. He looked at her for 3 seconds. 3. Then he turned back toward the west staircase. Torres, he said into the earpiece, send a full team to Miss Marlowe's position. Escort her to the north shelter. Full escort. Make it happen. Yes, sir. And Mrs. Voss? I'm handling Mrs. Voss myself. He took the stairs 2 at a time. What he did not know, what he would not know until 40 minutes later when the compound was secured and the body count was being established, was that Torres had already given 4 men to Celeste's escort because Damian had asked for a full team, and that the 2 men originally posted outside Elena's door had been pulled to reinforce the East Corridor containment line based on a position call that went up the chain and got authorized in the chaos by someone who was trying to plug a hole in the wrong wall. What he did not know was that Elena had been awake since the first explosion, standing at her bedroom window in the dark, watching the same orange glow he had watched from his office, and that she was doing what she had learned to do over 11 years of being Damian Voss's wife. She was managing herself. She wasn't screaming down the hallway. She wasn't calling the house line. She was standing with her hand pressed to the side of her stomach, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth, taking inventory of her options with the same cold practicality that had made her the only person in Damian's orbit who could look at his full operation without flinching. What he did not know was that when the 2 men pulled away from her door, Elena heard their footsteps leave and understood immediately what it meant. She put on her shoes. She put on the coat that hung on the back of the closet door. She took the secondary phone from the drawer of her nightstand, the phone Damian had given her 3 years ago for exactly this kind of night, the one with a direct line to a number she'd memorized and never expected to use. And she put it in her coat pocket. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and waited, because she knew the compound layout, and she knew the sound of a firefight, and she knew that running blindly into a corridor without knowing where the hostiles were positioned was a faster way to get shot than anything else. Elena Whitmore had been making clear-eyed decisions under pressure since she was 19 years old. It was one of the things Damian had loved about her before he'd forgotten to keep loving it. Damian hit the door of the family wing at a controlled run and found the hallway empty. He stopped. His earpiece gave him nothing but a low hiss of interference. He tried Torres, no response. He tried Marcus. Static. Something was jamming the short-range signal, more sophisticated than a standard op. That told him something specific about who was running this. He moved down the corridor, back against the wall, to the door of Elena's room. Pressed his ear to the wood. Heard nothing. Tried the handle. Unlocked. He pushed it open and swept the room in 2 seconds. Empty. Bed empty, closet door open, coat gone from the hook he could see by the shape of its absence. She'd moved. He should have felt relieved. What he actually felt was a specific cold thing in the center of his chest that had nothing to do with the firefight. He moved back into the corridor and started toward the north staircase, working through the layout in his head, trying to map where she would go based on what she knew. Elena had been briefed on the compound's emergency protocols 3 years ago when they'd moved in. She knew the north shelter. She knew the west exit route. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was moving alone through a compound that had active hostiles on at least 2 floors. The shooting was still going on below him, sporadic now, which meant the initial breach was being contained but not neutralized. He counted the time between bursts. 12 seconds. 7. 15. His people were holding ground, not advancing. The hostiles had gone to ground somewhere on the first floor. He took the north staircase to the ground level and came out into the kitchen corridor just in time to see Elena. She was 15 feet ahead of him, moving at a measured walk toward the north shelter door at the end of the corridor. Not running. She couldn't run. Not at this stage, not with her center of gravity where it was, but moving with the kind of deliberate, controlled speed that was almost worse to watch than panic, because it meant she had calculated the fastest safe pace, and she was executing it without anyone telling her to, without anyone's help, in the dark, alone. She turned at the sound of his footsteps. Her face in the low emergency lighting was the color of chalk. Her hair was loose. One hand was pressed to her stomach, and the other held the secondary phone, the one he'd given her for this exact contingency, and the expression she was wearing when she turned and saw him was not relief. It wasn't fear. It was something that took him a half-second longer than it should have to identify, because he wasn't used to seeing it on her face. It was the look of a person who expected to be on their own, confirming that they were. "Elena, I'm fine," she said. "How far to the shelter?" 30 feet. "Elena, is it clear?" He moved to her side, put himself between her and the direction of the gunfire, took her arm. She let him. That was all. She looked straight ahead, and she let him steer her toward the shelter door, and she didn't say another word, and somehow that was louder than anything she could have screamed. He got her inside. The shelter was a reinforced room beneath the north end of the house, 8 by 12, concrete walls, a ventilated steel door. 2 other staff members were already inside, a cook and a housekeeper, sitting against the far wall looking destroyed. There was a first aid kit and 2 cases of water and a battery-powered light that turned everything the color of old bone. Damian secured the door and turned to look at his wife. Elena had lowered herself onto the bench along the side wall. She was still breathing in and out in that measured way, one hand on her stomach. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the middle distance, at nothing. "There were no men on your door," he said. "No. There should have been 4. There weren't any." He crouched in front of her. "Elena." She looked at him then, directly. The thing in her eyes was controlled in a way that meant it was too large to be anything else. "How's Celeste?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. The 2 staff members by the far wall became extremely interested in the floor. Damian didn't look away from her. "She's on her way to the shelter with a full escort." "Good." Elena looked back at the middle distance. "Good. That's good." "Elena." "Damian." Her voice was very quiet, very even. "Don't. I need to. Not right now." She turned back to him, and there was something exhausted in it, something that went deeper than tonight. "Not in here, not like this, not in front of—" She stopped, started again. "I'm tired. The baby's been moving since the first blast. I'd like to just sit here and be quiet for a little while." He looked at her. He didn't stand up. "You put a full team on her," Elena said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was the tone of a woman who had done math, not the kind that used numbers. "Before you came to me." He said nothing, because what he said next would either be a lie or the truth, and he wasn't sure which one was worse. Elena read his silence the same way she'd been reading his silences for 11 years. Her jaw did something small and tight. Then she looked back at the middle distance and pressed her free hand flat on her knee and breathed in and breathed out. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." The firefight above them lasted another 38 minutes. Damian stayed in the shelter. He knew he should be out there running his operation, calling the shots, giving orders. Marcus could handle it. Marcus had been handling it for years. But there was a thing that happened when a boss went to ground during an active breach, and it sent a signal through the whole organization like a frequency through water. He knew this. He stayed anyway. He sat against the wall opposite Elena with the pistol across his knee and listened to the muffled percussion above them and watched his wife not look at him. She looked at the wall. She looked at her hands. She looked at the phone she was still holding, the one he'd given her because he'd planned for this, for the night when everything went wrong, because a man like Damian Voss knew that eventually everything does. He had planned for an attack. He had planned evacuation routes and protocol trees and designated safe positions, and he had rehearsed the variables in his head 100 times. He had planned for almost everything. What he had not planned for was himself. The cook fell asleep at some point, or something close to sleep. The housekeeper, a woman named Patricia, who had worked the compound for 9 years, sat with her rosary in her hands and her lips moving without sound. Damian looked at Elena. Elena looked at the wall. He thought about what he had done, not the tactical decision. He could argue the tactical decision 3 ways and come out ahead every time. Celeste was closer to the breach point. Celeste had no protocol training. Celeste was... He killed that line of reasoning before it finished itself, because he knew, in the place where he was honest with himself in the dark, that none of that was why he'd sent the team to Suite 12 first. He'd sent them because Celeste had looked at him with those eyes and said, "Don't leave me here." And Elena had not been there to look at him at all, and he had done what he had probably been doing for 8 months, which was to move toward the thing that made demands of him, because demands meant he was needed, and being needed felt like being in control. And control was the thing Damian Voss had spent his entire adult life organizing his psychology around. He did not articulate any of this in the shelter. He sat with it the way you sit with a stone in your shoe, aware of it, unable to ignore it, not ready to stop and deal with it. Marcus's voice came through the earpiece at 1:27 a.m. "Compound is clear. 12 hostiles neutralized, 3 taken alive for questioning. We lost Ruiz and 2 others on the east perimeter. 4 wounded." A pause. "Boss, you good?" "I'm good." "Mrs. Voss?" Damian looked at his wife. "She's safe." He heard Marcus breathe. "Copy that." "Celeste?" "Secure. North shelter, north end, came in about 40 minutes ago." Another pause, this one careful. "She's already asking about arrangements, wants to know about getting back to the city." "Tell her in the morning." "Copy." Damian stood up. He looked at Elena. "It's clear." She nodded. She put both hands on her knees to brace herself and started to rise, and he moved to help her, and she accepted the help without looking at him, the way you accept a hand from a stranger. They walked back through the compound in silence. The east wing was partially destroyed. There was smoke damage in the main corridor, glass from the blown-out windows catching the light in pieces across the floor. 2 of his men were moving through with flashlights, clearing debris, doing the grim inventory work that came after. They nodded to him when he passed. They didn't look at Elena. He walked her to the family wing, to a room that wasn't hers. Her room had a broken window from the percussion of the blast, cold air coming in through the gap, and he wasn't putting her in there tonight. He found the guest room at the end of the hall, checked it himself, then held the door open. Elena walked past him into the room. At the threshold she stopped, didn't turn around. "The men on my door," she said. "Who pulled them?" "I don't know yet." "Find out." "I will." She nodded once, went inside, did not close the door in his face, just walked away from it, walked to the window that faced the west garden, the dark, safe part of the property, and stood there with her hands at her sides. He pulled the door closed behind her. He stood in the corridor for a long time after that. Marcus found him there 20 minutes later, coming down the hall with his jacket torn at the shoulder and dried blood on his left forearm that probably wasn't his. "Carrera's people," Marcus said without preamble. "Confirmed. We found patches on 2 of the bodies." "Carrera," Damian said the name flatly. "He doesn't move this fast without a reason." "No." "Which means he had information." Marcus stopped walking. "Yeah." "Which means someone gave it to him." "Yeah." Marcus's face was doing the thing it did when he had more to say and was choosing his words with equipment. "Boss, there's something else. One of the men we took alive. He's in bad shape. He's not going to last, but he said something before he went under. Something about the timing." "What about it?" He said, Marcus cleared his throat. A tell from a man who had almost no tells. He said they knew your schedule, who was in which part of the house, where you'd be. Damian went still. Said they specifically targeted the East Wing first because they knew you'd split your response between the East Wing and the family wing. Marcus met his eyes. And that you wouldn't know which way to go. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere below them, a piece of glass fell out of a window frame and shattered on the courtyard stones. Someone didn't just know the layout, Damian said. No. Someone knew about Celeste being here. He said it very carefully, the way you step onto ice you're not sure will hold. Someone knew that if they hit the East Wing first, I'd have to choose. Marcus said nothing. The silence between them had a specific architecture. That's not a security breach, Damian said. That's a psychological operation. Yeah. Damian stood in the corridor outside the door where his wife was standing in the dark and turned the geometry of it over in his mind and felt something very cold begin to settle into the space behind his sternum. Because if this wasn't just an attack on his compound, but an attack on his decision-making, if someone had designed the scenario specifically to drive a wedge through the fault line in his life, then the question wasn't just who was feeding information to Carrera. The question was who knew enough about the inside of his private life to know exactly where the fault line was. Pull everything, Damian said. Every log, every communication, every access record for the past 6 weeks. Nobody leaves the property until I've looked at it. Already moving, Marcus hesitated. And Celeste? Damian said nothing for a long moment. She stays until I decide otherwise, he said finally. But you put someone on her door, not to protect her. Marcus understood. He was good at understanding the things that were left in the space between words. He nodded once and walked away down the corridor. Damian stood alone. He looked at the closed door to his right. He thought about Elena on the other side of it, standing at the window with her hands at her sides, doing the math that had no numbers. He had 40 years of experience making decisions under pressure. He'd made decisions that moved markets and ended careers and put men in the ground. Decisions that took half a second and carried consequences that lasted decades. He'd built something out of nothing, and the thing he'd built had turned into an empire that other men planned their operations around. Tonight, in a corridor where the emergency lights were still throwing their cold light across the floor, with smoke in his clothes and a dead weight behind his ribs, Damian Voss understood that the most consequential decision he'd made in months had taken him 3 seconds. And he'd made the wrong one. He didn't know yet the extent of what that choice had set in motion. He didn't know that Elena, on the other side of the door, was not standing at the window anymore. She had sat down on the edge of the unfamiliar bed with the secondary phone in her hands, and she was looking at a number she had memorized 2 years ago, a number that had nothing to do with Damian's organization, a number that had to do with her own plans, her own contingencies, the architecture of her own survival that she had been quietly constructing in the margins of their marriage, like a woman who knew that eventually the margins would matter. She didn't dial it. Not yet. She sat with her thumb over the number and breathed in and breathed out and felt the baby move. Not yet. But she had begun. She didn't sleep. Elena sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed until the sky outside the west garden window went from black to the color of a bruise, then to the flat gray of early morning, and she breathed in and breathed out and kept her hand on her stomach and did not cry. Crying required a specific kind of permission that she had stopped giving herself somewhere around the 6th month, when she'd understood that the distance she felt from Damian wasn't the ordinary distance of a busy man with a dangerous business, but something structural, something that had been built piece by piece over the course of a year until it had load-bearing walls. She got up at 6, washed her face, found a clean shirt in the guest room dresser, one of Damian's, left there from some other occasion, too big across the shoulders, the sleeves rolling past her wrists. She put it on anyway. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time, not with vanity, not with grief, the way a mechanic looks at an engine, trying to determine the extent of the damage. Then she went downstairs. The main house was in controlled chaos. Damian's men moved through the corridors with the clipped efficiency of people operating on no sleep and high adrenaline, carrying equipment, speaking in low voices into radios, stepping around the places where the cleanup crew hadn't finished yet. Nobody spoke to her directly. They moved out of her way when she walked through a room and they didn't meet her eyes, and she understood that the compound already knew. In organizations like this one, information moved the way blood moved, fast, along pathways that predated the injury. She found coffee in the kitchen and stood at the counter with both hands around the mug and looked out the window at the east courtyard. The wall was gone. A 12-foot section of it, the pale stone her mother-in-law had once called distinguished, was a pile of rubble and dust and twisted rebar. 2 men were photographing it. A third was measuring something with a tape. The fountain in the center of the courtyard was still running, which struck her as absurd. That water still moved in circles while everything else had stopped. "Mrs. Voss." She turned. Marcus was standing in the kitchen doorway. He looked like he hadn't closed his eyes at all. His jacket was gone, his shirt was rumpled at the collar, and the dried blood on his forearm from the night before had cracked into a dark line that traced the shape of a scratch rather than something worse. "Marcus," he came into the kitchen, didn't take coffee, just stood there with his arms at his sides, and there was something in the way he was standing, too still, too careful, that told her he had been deciding whether to have this conversation. "How are you feeling?" he said. "The baby's fine." "I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "I know you're fine. That's not what I meant." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. "Then say what you mean." A pause. "I pulled the log from last night, the position orders, the men who were on your door." "And?" "The pull order came from Torres, based on a request from the East Perimeter. Torres pulled them on his own authority. He said the request came up the chain." "Damian's chain?" Marcus's jaw moved. "Damian's orders were to put 4 men on your position. That order got cut somewhere between him and Torres. I'm trying to figure out where." Elena set the mug down. "What does Damian think?" "He thinks the breach was designed to split his attention, that someone inside gave Carrera enough information to engineer the scenario specifically. Someone who knew about the guest in Suite 12. Marcus didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She picked the mug back up. "How long has he known about the leak?" "He didn't know, not before last night." "But you suspected." The stillness in him changed quality, became something more precise. "I've had some concerns, for a few weeks." "Did you bring them to him?" "Elena, Marcus." She said his name the way she'd learned to say it over 11 years, which was not as his employer's wife, but as the person who kept the books that never got audited and knew things about this organization that Damian had stopped noticing she knew. "Did you bring your concerns to Damian?" "I brought him something adjacent to them," Marcus said carefully. "He was—" A pause. "His attention has been divided." The word divided landed in the kitchen and just sat there. "Right," Elena said. She finished the coffee, rinsed the mug, set it in the drying rack with the same deliberate motion she'd been using all morning. The motion of a person who is keeping themselves organized because organization is the thing standing between them and the thing they can't afford to feel right now. "Find out exactly where the order got cut," she said, "and find out how long that gap in the chain has been there, because I don't think it was created last night." Marcus looked at her for a moment. "Damian's running that investigation." "I know he is. I'm asking you to run it in parallel." A longer pause. I'm not asking you to go around him. I'm asking you to make sure that whatever gets found actually gets to the right person." She looked at him directly. "Because the last 6 months have made me less certain than I used to be about what information reaches my husband's desk and what gets filtered somewhere along the way." Marcus studied her face. He was a man who'd spent 20 years reading rooms and the people in them, and whatever he was reading now made him very quiet. "All right," he said. She nodded, walked to the kitchen door, stopped with her hand on the frame. "Is she still here?" She didn't have to say who. "Yes?" Marcus said. "Damian's orders." Elena's hand tightened on the frame, then released. "Okay," she said. Just that again. "Okay." The word she'd been using since she was 19 for everything that wasn't okay, because she'd learned young that the world did not pause for the things that broke you, and neither could you. She went upstairs. Damian found her in the East Library 2 hours later. She'd taken a book from the shelf. She couldn't have said which one. She hadn't read a word of it. And she was sitting in the armchair by the unbroken window with the book open in her lap and her eyes on the garden. He came in and closed the door behind him. He looked like the version of himself that showed up after the worst nights. Still put together, still upright, but with the seams showing in small ways. The set of his mouth, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, like a man who'd been moving fast all night and hadn't yet told his body it could stop. "Marcus told me you talked to him," Damian said. "I did." "You asked him to run a parallel investigation." "I asked him to make sure findings reached the right person." Damian's jaw worked. "I'm running the investigation, Elena." "I know." "Then why—" "Because 3 weeks ago you left a briefing from Marcus on your desk for 4 days before you read it," she said. Her voice was even. Not cold, not heated. Even, the way a surgeon is even. "I know, because Marcus mentioned it to me and asked if there was something going on, and I told him everything was fine, which it wasn't, but that's what I said." She looked up at him. "I want to find what you're trying to find. I want to know who did this. I'm not working against you." Damian crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her. He put his elbows on his knees and ran a hand across his jaw. He hadn't shaved. The gray in his stubble caught the morning light. More gray than there used to be, she thought. It had appeared the way most changes in him appeared, gradually and then all at once. "I need to talk to you about last night," he said. "Not now." "Elena?" "Damian." She closed the book. "Right now you have a leak in your organization, 3 dead men, and a rival family who ran a surgical operation on your compound using intelligence they shouldn't have been able to get. That is what matters right now." "You matter." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "I'm saying you matter." "I heard what you said." Her voice didn't change. "I'll still be here when the crisis is over." "The crisis won't wait." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and stood. "There's something you should know," he said. "The man we took alive, he's dead. Before dawn. Complications from his injuries." He said it flatly, no editorializing. But what he told Marcus before he went, whoever planned this knew about Celeste. Not just that she was here. They knew the timing of her arrival. They knew which suite. Elena was quiet for a moment. "Who made the arrangements for her visit?" Damian went still. "Who handled the logistics, the transport, the accommodation? Who knew she was coming 3 days in advance?" She said it with no particular emphasis, the way she'd ask who ordered the wrong invoice. But her eyes were on him, and they were very clear. "I handled most of it directly," he said. "Most. There would have been—" He stopped. "Staff. Security for the transport." "The transport team reported to who?" His expression shifted. "Torres." The name settled in the room. "I need to go," he said. "Yes?" She opened this book again. "You do?" He crossed to the door and stopped with his hand on it. "Are you eating?" It was such a specific question, so suddenly, disarmingly domestic in the middle of everything, that for one moment something moved across her face that might have been grief or might have been love in the form it takes when it's been worn down to its last layers. "I'll eat," she said. He went. Torres broke before noon, not dramatically. There was no confrontation with guns and raised voices, no cinematic unraveling. He was brought into the basement office, a room with concrete walls and a table and 2 chairs, and Damian sat across from him, and Marcus stood near the door, and Torres sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the space between them for 40 seconds before he started talking. His voice was almost apologetic, which was the worst kind. He'd been in contact with a man named Freitas, not Carrera directly, but Carrera's operations coordinator, a man who moved information and money across the boundaries of several organizations and kept his hands technically clean. Torres had given them compound schedules for 6 weeks, access logs, personnel positions. He'd done it for money, a specific amount that Damian would later learn was embarrassingly small relative to what it had cost. He hadn't known they were planning an attack. He said this 3 times. He'd thought he was selling administrative intelligence, the kind that could be used for leverage or negotiation. He hadn't understood that he was handing someone a blueprint. Damian listened to all of it without speaking. He sat with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing, which was more frightening than any expression, and he listened until Torres ran out of things to say and sat there with his hands on the table and his eyes finally coming up to meet Damian's. "Did Celeste know you were giving them her schedule?" Damian said. Torres blinked. "What?" "Her arrival, her suite assignment. You coordinated her transport." Yes, I handled the logistics." "Did she know you were passing information to Freitas?" A longer pause. Torres's hands moved slightly on the table. "No, she didn't know anything about—" "Are you certain?" "I'm certain. I swear to you. She had nothing to do with—" "Don't swear to me," Damian said. "You've been lying to me for 6 weeks. Your word has a specific value right now, and we both know what it is." Torres looked back at the table. "Get him out," Damian said to Marcus. He sat in the basement office alone for a few minutes after they took Torres out. He sat with his hands on the table, the same flat surface, and he thought about the geometry of what had happened. Torres was the leak. Torres was genuinely probably telling the truth about Celeste, because Torres had enough to answer for, and confessing to conspiracy was at this point a marginal addition to his problems. And a man looking at his situation honestly would not add charges he didn't have to. But the question had not occurred to Damian only because of logic. It had occurred to him because he had been turning it over since the kitchen conversation with Elena that morning, since the precision of her question, who handled the logistics, and what it said about the way her mind was working. She'd gone directly to the correct variable in under 10 seconds. Without knowing about Freitas, without knowing about Torres, she'd simply mapped the probable pathway and pointed at it. He thought about the briefing Marcus had left on his desk for 4 days. He thought about the things Elena had been telling him, in the particular language of Elena's silences and redirections, and carefully even tones, for the better part of a year. He had a leak. He'd found the leak. That was the part he was good at. The other part, the part where he'd spent 8 months arranging his life around a woman who'd been managing herself through what was coming without telling him, without asking him, because she'd stopped trusting him to show up. That was the part he didn't know how to address, and the fact that he didn't know was itself information. He went upstairs. Celeste was in the north drawing room when he found her. She'd changed into something from her bag. Clean, put together, the version of herself she deployed when she was establishing a position. She was standing near the window with a coffee cup, and she turned when he came in with the specific expression of a woman who has been waiting and has decided to manage how that waiting looks. "Damian," she set the cup down. Can I go home?" "Soon." Her eyes moved over his face. She was good at reading him, or had learned to be, which wasn't the same thing. "You found the leak." "I did." "Torres." He looked at her. "How did you know that?" Something crossed her face, a half-second of miscalculation. "I didn't. It was a guess. He was the one who handled my arrangements. It was a specific guess." "Damian, did you know Torres was compromised?" The stillness that came over her then had a different quality than Torres's stillness. Torres had gone still like a man who'd been caught. Celeste went still like a woman deciding, very quickly, which version of the truth served her best. "No," she said. "Celeste, I didn't know." Her voice gained a layer of something, not defensiveness, something more controlled. "I suspected something was off with him, maybe 2 weeks ago. He was asking questions that didn't match his role, about who was on property, about scheduling." She paused. "I didn't bring it to you because I didn't have anything concrete, and because—" She stopped. "Because what?" "Because I knew that if I brought concerns about your staff to you, it would create a situation, and I didn't want to create a situation." Damian looked at her for a long time. "You suspected a security concern in my compound," he said, "where my pregnant wife lives, and you sat on it. I said I wasn't certain. You sat on it." His voice hadn't raised. It never raised. It had just gotten to the place it sometimes got, which was below conversational, almost gentle, and in that register it meant something entirely different than gentleness. You could have come to me. You could have come to Marcus. You had a 2-week window and you did nothing. I was protecting the situation. You were protecting yourself." He said it without heat, which made it worse. "You were protecting whatever this—" He gestured between them, a minimal gesture, almost weary. "Whatever arrangement you thought we had." Celeste's composure developed a hairline fracture. Small, visible only because he'd been looking at her face long enough to know its architecture. "That's not fair. I'm not interested in fair right now. Damian?" Her voice dropped to the register she used when she wanted to access something specific between them. I know it was complicated, but I also know that when it came down to it, you sent your men to me first. That means something." He looked at her. "It means something," she said again. Quieter, more certain. "Yeah," he said. "It does." He turned and walked to the door. "I want a car to the city by tonight," he said without turning around. "You'll have it." He heard her behind him, heard her start to say something, and then stop. He didn't look back. The rest of the afternoon moved in the grim procedural rhythm of damage control. Calls to lawyers. Calls to 2 other family heads who needed to hear about the Carrera move from him before they heard it elsewhere. A meeting with the remaining floor team to restructure the security rotation. The bodies of Ruiz and the 2 others, arrangements made through the specific channels that handled such arrangements. Marcus moved through all of it beside him with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before and would do it again. And at no point between noon and 6 p.m. did he say the thing that was sitting between them, which was that Torres had been in place for 3 years, had been vouched for by 2 people Damian trusted, and had been given access to scheduling and logistics precisely because Damian had been too preoccupied over the past year to manage those details himself. At 6, Marcus knocked on the office door and came in without waiting. "Car's ready for Marlowe," he said. "Good." "Elena's been in the library all day." A pause. "She hasn't eaten." Damian looked up from the desk. "I had someone take a tray up. She said she wasn't hungry." Marcus's face was careful. "She's been making calls." "To who?" "Don't know. Her personal line." He hesitated. "Damian, she had that secondary phone with her last night, the one you gave her for emergencies." "I know." "She was looking at it in the shelter. I saw it." Marcus paused. "I don't know what's on it, but whatever number she was thinking about dialing, she'd memorized it. You don't memorize a number you're not serious about." Damian sat back in his chair. Marcus left. He went to the library at 6:30. Elena was still in the armchair. The book was gone. The tray of food was on the side table, untouched. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and looking at the garden, and there was something in her posture that had changed since morning. A quality of having made a decision, or of being close to one, the specific kind of stillness that precedes movement. "Torres confessed," he said. "Carrera's man. We're handling the Carrera situation." She nodded. "Celeste is leaving tonight." A longer pause. Something moved in her profile. Then, "That's not because of me." "No," he said. "It's not." "Then why?" He sat down across from her. The same 2 chairs as this morning. The light had shifted. Evening now, the garden going to blue outside the window. "Because she sat on information that could have prevented last night. Because she made a calculation about what was worth protecting, and it wasn't this." He gestured, a small motion. "Any of this." Elena looked at him then, really looked at him, for the first time since the shelter, without the managed distance she'd been maintaining all day. "That's not the whole reason," she said. "No." He met her eyes. "It's not." The silence between them had a different quality than it had this morning. This morning's silence was a wall. This one was more like an open door with a complicated threshold. "Damian," she said. Her voice was quieter than it had been all day. "I have to tell you something." He waited. "I've been in contact with someone." She held his gaze. "For the past 4 months. Someone outside the organization." She paused. "Someone who can help me if I need to leave." The room went very still. "Not a man," she said, reading something in his face. "A lawyer. A specific kind of lawyer. I started—" She stopped. looked at her hands. I started making arrangements, quietly, because I didn't know what was coming, and I needed to know I had options. He said nothing. He couldn't. There was nothing that could be said in the space of the next few seconds that would not make something worse. I'm not telling you this to threaten you, Elena said. I'm telling you because last night I was standing in a hallway alone with two men who should have been there gone, and I understood something I'd been trying not to understand. She looked back up at him. You didn't make a tactical decision. You made an instinctive one, and the instinct... She stopped. Then, very carefully, the instinct went somewhere that wasn't me. Damian's hands were flat on his knees. His jaw was tight. I know you love me, she said. I'm not saying you don't. I'm saying that love and instinct aren't the same thing, and last night I learned what yours is pointed at. She put her hand back on her stomach. And I have to decide what to do with that information, for me, and for this baby. She held his gaze. I'm not going anywhere tonight, but I need you to know that the option exists and I'm not afraid to use it. Damian looked at her, at the face he had known for 11 years, which was the face of someone who was done waiting to be found. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again, and the words that came out were not the right words. He could hear that they were not the right words even as he said them. I can protect you here. I know you can, Elena said. That's not what I asked for. She stood up, moved to the door. Elena, she stopped. The number you memorized, he said, on the secondary phone. She turned to look at him. Don't dial it yet, he said. There was a moment, very small, the length of a breath, where something moved through her face that might have been the last thread of something that could still be pulled back from the edge. Then give me a reason not to, she said. She walked out. He sat in the library alone while the garden went dark outside the window, and he was still sitting there when Marcus came in 20 minutes later with the expression of a man carrying news that had arrived at the worst possible time. Damian, Marcus's voice was very flat. We have a problem. Another one. We just got a call from our contact at the federal building downtown. He paused. The Carrera operation last night. It wasn't just an attack. Damian looked at him. It was a setup, Marcus said. For us. They tipped the feds, anonymously, an hour before the breach. Told them a major trafficking operation was being run out of this compound, and last night was a scheduled exchange. His jaw worked. We've got a federal investigation opening in the next 48 hours, and the tip included documentation. Financial records, shipping manifests, routing information. A pause. Information that could only have come from deep inside this, the word that Marcus didn't finish, hung in the air of the library like smoke after a shot. Information that could only have come from deep inside this organization, Damian said. Yes. He stood up from the chair. Not fast, controlled, deliberate. The way a man stands when he knows that whatever his body does in the next 10 seconds is going to set the register for everything that follows. He walked to the window. The garden was fully dark now. His own reflection looked back at him from the glass, and he studied it for a moment the way he'd studied Elena's face earlier, clinically, trying to assess damage. How specific is the documentation? He said. Specific enough that it didn't come from Torres. Marcus's voice was careful. Torres had access to scheduling and logistics. What they sent the feds, shipping manifests, financial routing, account structures, that's a different tier of access entirely. How many people have that tier? At this level, 4. Me, you, our accountant Reeves, and... Marcus stopped. Damian turned from the window. The name that Marcus wasn't saying was in the room between them, filling it up. Say it, Damian said. Marcus's jaw worked. Brennan. Daniel Brennan. Damian's CFO, his financial architect, the man who had built the routing structures that moved money through 7 different shells across 4 states. The man who had been with him for 14 years, who had been at his wedding, who had held the pen that signed the papers on this compound. The man Damian would have listed, without hesitation, in the top 3 people on Earth he trusted absolutely. You're sure, Damian said. The routing information in the federal tip, it uses a specific notational system that Brennan developed. It's not something you'd reverse engineer from outside. It's his system, his handwriting, essentially. Where is he now? That's the other thing. Marcus's voice dropped further. He left the compound this morning, 6 a.m., before the sun was up, said he had a family situation. Did anyone verify? No. At 6 a.m., we were still doing body counts and running breach assessment. Nobody was tracking Brennan's movements. Damian stood very still. Outside the window, the darkness was complete. In the reflection, he could see the library behind him, the empty chairs, the untouched food tray, the place where Elena had been sitting when she told him she had a lawyer and a number memorized and a plan that didn't include him. He thought about 14 years. He thought about the specific weight of 14 years of trust, what it looked like, what it felt like to carry it around and never question it because you'd put it in the category of things that were settled. He thought about how the settled things were always the ones that killed you. Find him, Damian said, working on it. Don't call him, don't tip him. Just find him and don't let him know he's found. Understood. And Marcus. He turned from the window. The federal documentation? Is there anything in it that touches Elena? Marcus held his gaze. Not directly. But she's listed as a signatory on 2 of the shell company structures. Routine, from when you set them up. Her name's on the paperwork. If the investigation goes far enough, it touches her. Eventually, yes. Damian left the library. He moved through the compound with the particular efficiency of a man who has internalized the fact that the ground has shifted and is already recalculating. His people moved out of his path. They could read the specific quality of his stillness. It was a thing you learned, working for Damian Voss, the way weather forecasters learn to read cloud formations. This particular stillness meant that something had broken, and he was the only one who knew how bad it was yet, and the best thing to do was stay out of the trajectory. He went to the north corridor and knocked on the door of the room where Elena had been moved for the night. A pause. Then her voice muffled through the door. What? I need to talk to you. Another pause, longer. Then the sound of movement, and the door opened. She was in the oversized shirt still, his shirt, and she looked at him with the face of a woman who had been lying in the dark, not sleeping, and had been expecting something to come knock on her door, just not necessarily him. He told her, briefly, without editorializing, the federal tip, the documentation, the shell companies, her name on the paperwork. He watched her process it. Her face didn't collapse. It never did. It went through something sequential, like a machine running a diagnostic. Surprise, then rapid calculation, then a settling into a kind of grim clarity that was almost worse than distress because it meant she'd immediately begun planning. How long before they move, she said. 48 hours. Maybe less if they pushed for expedited warrants. My name is on the Calder Holdings documents and the Meridian structure. Those are the 2 that have active transaction histories. She said it. Those, I'm a co-signatory on transfers that look, from the outside, like I was involved in the operational decisions. You weren't. I know I wasn't. That's not what the documents show. She looked at him. You need to get me documentation of what I actually was. A signatory on paper for legal structuring purposes, with no operational involvement. You need a paper trail that proves that, and you need it before the warrants are served. I'm working on it. Work faster. She said it without heat. Just the flat, practical directive of a woman who understood that the difference between being charged as a witness and charged as a co-conspirator was a piece of paper and a timeline. He looked at her. Elena, don't. She shook her head. Don't do the thing where you apologize right now. I don't have capacity for that right now. Fix it first. He nodded, turned to go. Damian, her voice stopped him. Brennan. He turned. He was at our wedding, she said. She said it without particular emotion, the way you state coordinates. He was at every Christmas dinner for 8 years. He sent flowers when I had the miscarriage in 2019. A pause. He's the one who suggested I be added as a signatory to the Calder structure 3 years ago. He said it was for legal efficiency in case you were ever unreachable. The temperature in the corridor seemed to drop. He planned this a long time ago, she said. This isn't opportunism, this is architecture. Damian stood in his doorway and felt something cold and specific move through him that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite grief, and was perhaps what you felt when you understood that the betrayal you were looking at had been constructed over years, with patience, by someone who ate at your table and watched your face and learned the exact shape of the life he was going to dismantle. "Get some sleep," he said, because there was nothing else to say. "You too," she said, which was automatic, habitual, 11 years of a specific domesticity that survived even this. She closed the door. Damian found Brennan at 1:14 in the morning, not through fieldwork, through a phone. Brennan had made one call from a cell registered to a name that wasn't his, but the tower ping put him 20 miles south of the compound, at a mid-range hotel off the interstate that was the kind of place you stopped at if you were moving between two other places and didn't want to be remembered. Marcus's man confirmed the visual at 1 a.m. Brennan was in room 114, ground floor, one bag, his personal laptop. He'd ordered room service at 11 and had been in the room since. Damian drove down himself. Marcus drove. Two other men in the follow vehicle. Nobody spoke. The interstate was near empty at this hour, the highway lights throwing pools of orange across the asphalt in regular intervals. And Damian sat in the passenger seat and looked at the road and said nothing for 20 miles. They took the room without announcement. The keycard was a 3-second problem for the man Marcus had brought. Brennan was sitting up in bed with the laptop open on his knees and his reading glasses on, and when the door came open, he looked up with the specific expression of a man who had known somewhere below the level of conscious acknowledgement that this moment was coming, and had not fully believed it would feel like this. He closed the laptop. He took off his glasses. He set them on the nightstand. "Damian," he said. Damian sat down in the chair at the foot of the bed. Marcus and the other men were at the door. The room was small and beige and smelled like carpet cleaner and old air conditioning, and the television was off and the silence was complete. "Tell me why," Damian said. Brennan looked at his hands on the closed laptop. He was 61 years old. He had the hands of a man who had spent his life at desks, soft-palmed, precise. Those hands had built the financial architecture of an empire, had signed documents that moved millions, had structured the arrangements that kept Damian Voss invisible to the people who were paid to find him. "Carrera made contact 2 years ago," Brennan said. "Not slowly, steadily, like a man who had rehearsed this conversation and was now moving through it because there was no other direction available. Through an intermediary. He wasn't asking for information. He was asking if I would consider a transition." "A transition?" "He thought your organization was going to collapse within 3 years. He said it as an analysis, not a threat. He laid out the structural reasons." Brennan's eyes came up. He was right about most of them. "And so you decided to accelerate the process." "I decided to position myself for what was coming regardless." He said it without flinching, which was a specific kind of courage or a specific kind of absence of shame, and Damian wasn't sure which. "I'm 61 years old. I don't have another 20 years to build something new. If the Voss organization goes under federal investigation and gets dismantled, I need to be on the other side of that." "You put my wife's name on federal documents." Something moved in Brennan's face, the first thing that looked like discomfort. That was, the Calder signatory was legitimate structuring. "I didn't anticipate you put her name on it 3 years ago, and then you handed those documents to the federal government last night." Damian's voice was still quiet, still even. "You knew her name was on them." Brennan's mouth opened, closed. "She's 8 months pregnant," Damian said. The room was silent. "I didn't design it to touch her," Brennan said. His voice had lost some of its steadiness. "The federal disclosure was meant to create pressure on the organization, not on... She's a signatory on active transaction documents that you handed to federal investigators." The quiet in Damian's voice had reached the place below quiet, the place that was almost inaudible. "Whatever you intended, what you did was put a pregnant woman's name in front of a federal investigation, my wife, who has nothing to do with the operational side of this organization and never did." Brennan looked at his hands again. Something was happening in his face that might have been the beginning of genuine reckoning, the slow recognition that the architecture of a plan and the reality of its consequences were different structures, and that he had been living in the first one without fully inhabiting the second. "Where's the documentation?" Damian said. "The full package, what you sent them, and what you held back." "I sent everything." "You sent everything." Damian looked at him. Then you have nothing left to negotiate with. Brennan's head came up. You thought you were holding leverage, Damian said. You thought there was a version of this where you walk into whatever arrangement you've made with Carrera with enough value to buy yourself a clean position. He leaned forward slightly. But you sent everything to the feds last night, which means Carrera already got whatever you were going to give him, or you panicked and moved too fast. And either way, you're sitting in a hotel room with a laptop and one bag and no leverage left. And the only person in the world right now who can decide what happens to you is me. Brennan was very still. The federal documentation, Damian said. Is there anything in it that my lawyers can't challenge? Anything that didn't go through you? Original documents, physical records, something that can't be argued as fabricated or misattributed? A pause. The Meridian routing files. I have the originals. On the laptop. Yes. Damian looked at Marcus. Marcus crossed the room and picked up the laptop. The Calder signatory documents, Damian said. The ones with Elena's name. Is there anything in the federal package that shows her making operational decisions, emails, call logs, anything she actually did? No. Brennan said it quickly. There's nothing like that because there was nothing like that. She was a name on a document. I can provide a statement, an affidavit, clarifying her role. You'll do more than that. Damian stood. You're going to walk into the federal building tomorrow morning with my attorney, and you're going to provide a full account of what you submitted, why, and the context of how those shell structures were built, and who actually made the operational decisions. You're going to clarify Elena's role in terms that leave no ambiguity. Brennan looked at him. And in return, what happens to you happens here, between us, and not in a way that involves you never being seen again. Damian held his gaze. That's the negotiation. It wasn't a kind offer, but it was the only one on the table, and Brennan was 61 years old and he'd run the numbers, which was what he'd always done. All right, Brennan said. They drove back to the compound in the same silence. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. Not sunrise yet, but the first suggestion of it, the darkness going from black to a deep, exhausted navy. Damian sat in the passenger seat and looked at the road and thought about 14 years and what they were worth, and the answer that kept coming back was nothing and everything simultaneously, which was not a useful answer, but was the true one. His phone rang at 3 a.m. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 17 years of this work, made him pick up. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Controlled, professional, with the specific inflection of someone accustomed to delivering information that changed things. Mr. Voss, my name is Agent Dana Reyes. I'm with the Financial Crimes Unit. I apologize for the hour. He said nothing. In the driver's seat, Marcus had gone very still. I'm calling because we received an anonymous tip last evening related to your organization, Reyes said. I want you to know that we're aware the documentation may have been submitted with intent to manipulate rather than with legitimate public interest concerns. We're not... A pause. We're not unsophisticated about how these things work. Why are you calling me directly, Damian said. Because there's a person of interest in this case who we've been building a file on for considerably longer than last night. And that person is not you. Another pause, measured, deliberate. We're going to be at your property tomorrow, 9 a.m. I'd like you to have counsel present. I'd also like, and I'm being direct here because I think direct is more efficient, I'd like Elena Whitmore present. The sound of his wife's name in the mouth of a federal agent at 3 in the morning was a specific kind of cold. My wife is pregnant, he said. She's not, I know. We'll make it as brief as possible. Reyes's voice didn't waver. Mr. Voss, Elena Whitmore has been in contact with our office. Not last night, for the past 4 months, through a private attorney. A pause. She's been cooperating with an adjacent inquiry, one that predates last night's events by some time. The car was completely silent. She came to us, Reyes said, her voice careful. Voluntarily, with information about financial structures she felt were being built around her without her knowledge or consent. She wasn't reporting on you. Another pause, and this one had a different weight. She was reporting on Brennan. She flagged the Calder signatory arrangement 18 months after it was set up, when she started to understand why her name had been added. Damian sat in the passenger seat of his own car at 3 in the morning on a highway going back to his compound and felt the architecture of the past 4 months rearrange itself around him into a shape he hadn't been able to see until this moment. Elena had not been making plans to leave. She had been making plans to fight, differently than he would, on a different front, through different channels, with a different kind of weapon. She had looked at the structure being built around her name, and she had done what Elena Whitmore had always done. She had found the most precise available tool, and she had started using it quietly, without announcement, without asking his permission. She hadn't told him because she didn't know if she could trust him, and she hadn't known if she could trust him because for 8 months he had been giving her reasons not to. 9 a.m., he said. 9 a.m., Reyes confirmed. He ended the call. Marcus drove. The sky continued its slow migration from navy to the first pale gray of dawn. The compound appeared ahead of them, its lights visible through the trees, the broken east wall a dark gap in the outline like a missing tooth. "She's been working with the feds," Marcus said. Not an accusation, not even surprise, just a man processing a fact. "On Brennan," Damian said. "Not on us." "For 4 months." "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She knew about Brennan before we did." "She suspected. She moved on it." He looked out the window at the compound coming closer. "She didn't tell me because she didn't know if I'd protect the organization over her." Another silence. "Would you have?" Marcus said. It was the kind of question that Marcus almost never asked. Direct, personal, the kind that stepped across the line of his professional role. He asked it anyway, which meant he thought it mattered. Damian thought about the shelter. He thought about the corridor and the 3 seconds, and the decision that had taken 3 seconds when it should have taken none. He thought about Elena standing in the library with her hand on her stomach, telling him she had a number memorized, telling him she was not afraid to use it. He thought about what she had actually done with that number. Not run, not escape. She had used it to fight for the things she had her name on, the life she had built here. The child who was going to be born into this world in approximately 4 weeks and needed a mother who was not standing in front of a federal judge. "I don't know," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 8 months. Marcus pulled through the gate. The compound received them in its damaged procedural silence. Men on patrol. Lights in the east where the cleanup was still ongoing. The fountain still running in the courtyard, still absurd, still moving in its small circle regardless of what had happened around it. Damian got out of the car, stood for a moment in the pre-dawn cold with his hand on the roof of the vehicle. Then he went inside, and he went upstairs, and he stood outside Elena's door for a long time before he knocked. She answered faster than she should have if she'd been sleeping, which confirmed she hadn't. She looked at him through the gap in the door. Her face read the thing in his expression, whatever it was, whatever had settled there on the drive back, and something shifted in her own. Not softening, exactly. More like the specific adjustment of a person who has been braced for impact and is recalculating the direction of what's coming. "You talked to Reyes," she said. "She called me." He paused. "You've been working this for 4 months." "Yes." "Brennan. I didn't have his name until 6 weeks ago. Before that, I just had the structure and the feeling that something in it was wrong." "You didn't tell me." She held his gaze. "No. Because you didn't know because I didn't know if the organization would take priority," she said. It was precise, not cruel. The distinction she'd drawn for herself somewhere in the 4 months of doing this alone. "I didn't know if you'd see Brennan as an asset to protect or a liability to expose. And I couldn't afford to find out the wrong way." He looked at her. The door was still half closed between them. "The Calder documents," he said. "Reyes says your cooperation covers you. Your lawyer got you a clean position." "That was the arrangement, yes." "It was smart," he said. "It was the right move." She looked at him without particular expression. "Reyes wants you there tomorrow at 9, he said, "with counsel." "I know. She texted my attorney an hour ago." He stood in the doorway. The corridor was cold. The emergency lights had been switched back to the regular fixtures, and in the normal light he could see her more clearly than he had all day. The exhaustion under her eyes, the specific quality of someone who had been load-bearing for a very long time and was very close to the limit of what a person can carry. "Elena," he said. She waited. "I'm sorry." He said it without preamble, without the qualifying architecture that men like him built around apologies to make them less exposed. Just the two words, flat and without performance. "For the men not being on your door. For all of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hand moved to her stomach, the automatic, unconscious gesture she'd been making all day, and he'd been watching it all day, and it hit him now with a force it hadn't hit him with before, that there was a person in there, a specific, actual person who was going to come into the world in 4 weeks and was already being shaped by the temperature of the house they lived in. "I know," she said. "I made the wrong choice." "Yes, not just last night." She took a slow breath. "I know that too." The door was still between them. He didn't ask to come in. She didn't open it further. "The federal meeting tomorrow," he said. "I want to be in the room." "It's my meeting." "I know. I want to be there anyway." She studied him. Whatever she was looking for in his face, she looked for it long enough that he felt it, the weight of being read by a person who had always been able to read him more accurately than he read himself. "You can be there," she said. She started to close the door. "Elena." His voice stopped her. She looked at him through the narrowing gap. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Reyes has, whatever the investigation looks like, I need you to know that your name on those documents is my responsibility, not yours. I'll say that anywhere they need me to say it." Her jaw did the small, tight thing it had done this morning. Her eyes did something complicated. "Get some sleep," she said, and closed the door. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, down the hall, through the wall, through the dark compound and the broken east wall and the running fountain and the 3 dead men and the 14 years of Brennan's slow betrayal and the 8 months of his own, slower one. Through all of it, he could feel the specific shape of where he had arrived. He had built an empire on the principle that control was the only thing worth having. He had organized every relationship, every operation, every decision around the maintenance of that control, and he had been so focused on the external architecture of it that he had not noticed the thing eroding underneath it. Not the organization, not the security. Himself. And now his wife had done in 4 months what he hadn't been able to do in 14 years, which was look at the thing that was wrong and move toward it without waiting for permission, without announcing her intentions, without asking him whether it was convenient. She had fought for their life. While he was managing his arrangements, he went to his office. He sat at the desk. He did not sleep. The sky outside the window went through its slow transformation from dark to light, and when the sun finally came up, it came up on a compound that looked from the outside like a fortress that had survived an attack. From the inside, it looked like what it actually was, a structure in the process of being rebuilt from its most basic load-bearing elements, by 2 people who had not yet decided if they were rebuilding it together or separately, and would not know the answer until the moment came when one of them finally chose without hesitation, instinctively, with their whole body, the right thing. That moment was coming. It was 48 hours away, in a room with federal agents and lawyers and the full weight of everything that had been built and broken and hidden and exposed. And for the first time in 8 months, Damian Voss did not know what he was going to do when it arrived. He didn't sleep. He sat at his desk until 6 a.m. and then he showered and put on a suit. Not the kind he wore to intimidate, but the kind he wore when he needed to appear as something other than what he was, which was a man whose organization had a blown wall and 3 dead men and a federal meeting in 3 hours. And he went downstairs and found coffee and drank it standing at the kitchen counter, the same way Elena had stood there yesterday morning, looking out at the courtyard. The fountain was still running. He'd have to deal with that at some point. The symbolism of it was starting to bother him in a way that had nothing to do with the fountain. Marcus arrived at 7 with the attorneys, 2 of them, the criminal defense specialist named Hargrove, who had been on retainer for 11 years and never once been needed at this level, and a second attorney named Park, who handled civil and financial exposure and had been on the phone since 2 a.m. reviewing what Reyes's office had submitted. They set up in the dining room with laptops and printed documents and spoke to Damian in the low, rapid shorthand of professionals who had spent the night processing a situation and arrived at a position. The core exposure was Brennan's submitted package. Hargrove had already spoken with Reyes's office through back channels and confirmed what the agent had told Damian at 3 a.m. The investigation was targeting Brennan, not the Voss organization as a primary subject. The documentation Brennan had submitted was being evaluated for authenticity and chain of custody, and there were significant questions about whether it was submitted in good faith or as a retaliatory action against a former employer, which changed its evidentiary value considerably. Elena's position was cleaner than Damian had feared. Her 4 months of cooperation, documented, structured, provided through counsel, had established her as a cooperative witness with no operational involvement. The Calder signatory issue was addressable. Park had language for it. What remained was Damian himself, and what remained of his organization after the night's events. "You need to cooperate fully today," Hargrove said. He was a man in his late 50s with the face of someone who had heard every possible version of a bad situation and was not surprised by any of them. "Not performatively, fully. They're not coming in to arrest anyone this morning. They're coming in to take a read on who they're dealing with and whether it's worth their time and resources to push deeper. How this meeting goes determines the next 6 months." "I know how these meetings work," Damian said. "Then you know the difference between a man who cooperates because he has to and a man who cooperates because he's made a decision." Hargrove looked at him. "They can tell the difference. They've been doing this longer than either of us." Damian looked at the table. At the documents spread across it, the financial routing charts, the shell company diagrams, the annotated timeline that Park had built overnight showing the construction of the Calder structure, and Elena's purely administrative role in it, clean, professional, the paper architecture of a defense. He thought about 14 years. He thought about what Brennan had built and what Brennan had destroyed, and the specific logic of a man who looks at something he helped create and decides to strip it for parts before it collapses on its own. He thought about what Elena had done instead, looking at the same structure, the same threat, and choosing to fight for it rather than profit from its destruction. "I've made the decision," Damian said. At 8:55, 3 vehicles pulled through the compound gate. 2 sedans, 1 SUV, federal plates, the specific unhurried confidence of people who had the law moving with them rather than against them. Agent Reyes stepped out of the lead sedan and Damian got his first look at her. Middle 40s, compact, in a gray suit with a face that had been trained out of expressiveness and now communicated primarily through the precise calibration of silences. She shook his hand at the door. Her grip was firm, and she held it a half-second longer than courtesy required, which was a read. She was taking a read. "Mr. Voss," she said, "thank you for having us. Agent Reyes." He stepped back to let them in. "Coffee's in the dining room." She didn't take the coffee either. Elena came downstairs at 9 exactly. She had put on a dark blue dress that accommodated her pregnancy without emphasizing it, and her hair was pulled back, and she moved with the deliberate, measured pace she'd been using since the night before, conserving energy, conserving exposure, every movement calculated. She sat down at the dining room table next to Park and across from Reyes without looking at Damian, and then she looked at Damian, and the look lasted a second and conveyed something specific. "I've got my part. You get yours." He nodded once. Reyes laid her folder on the table and opened it. She did not preamble. She was, Damian thought, a woman who had learned that preambles gave people time to construct positions. "We've been looking at Daniel Brennan for 11 months, she said, "before last night. The financial irregularities he submitted to us last evening were, anticipated is the wrong word. They were in a category we were already examining." She looked at Damian. "What Brennan gave us was mostly things we already had, organized more conveniently." A pause while that landed. "What we didn't have," Reyes continued, "was the full picture of how the shell structures were built and who had actual operational involvement versus administrative presence. Mrs. Whitmore's cooperation over the past 4 months has been significant in helping us understand that distinction. She's a signatory on 2 structures," Hargrove said, "administrative, no transactional authority." "We understand that now." "Yes." Reyes's eyes moved to Elena. Thank you, for the record, for being forthcoming. In our experience, people in your position often choose not to be. Elena said nothing. She had her hands folded on the table and her face arranged in the professional stillness of a woman who understood that every word she said in this room was being evaluated. What we need from Mr. Voss today, Reyes said, turning back to Damian, is a full accounting of the Meridian and Calder structures. Origin, purpose, transaction history. Brennan built them, but you authorized them, and we need your version of that authorization on the record. He'll provide that, Hargrove said. In detail, Reyes said, not a summary. In detail. What followed was 3 hours. 3 hours of documents and questions and the specific grinding work of a federal interview conducted by a professional who knew exactly which questions to ask in which order and how long to let the silence sit after each answer. Damian talked. He had decided on the drive back from the hotel at 3 a.m. that he was going to tell the truth today, or the version of the truth that his attorney had shaped into the most survivable form, and that was what he did. He talked about Brennan. He talked about the structures. He talked about what he'd known and what he hadn't, and what he understood now about the gap between those two things. He was precise. He was controlled. He did not perform remorse, and he did not perform defiance. He sat in the chair at his own dining room table and answered the questions of a federal agent and felt, for the first time in years, the specific discomfort of a man who has spent his life controlling the frame of every room he walks into, discovering what it feels like when the frame belongs to someone else. At 12:15, Reyes closed her folder. We'll need follow-up interviews, she said. There will be a formal deposition, dates to be arranged through counsel. In the meantime, she looked at both of them. In the meantime, I want to be clear that the primary subject of this investigation is Daniel Brennan and his arrangement with the Carrera organization. We're aware of last night's events at the compound. We're also aware that the attack and the federal tip were coordinated. That coordination is something we're very interested in. She paused. Carrera's organization has been under a separate inquiry for 14 months. Last night may have accelerated that inquiry considerably. She stood. Her team stood with her. At the door, she stopped, turned. Mr. Voss. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who was about to say something that was not in the script. The men you lost last night. I'm sorry for that. He looked at her. Thank you. She left. The dining room was quiet for 30 seconds after the cars pulled out. Then Park started talking about next steps and deposition timelines, and Hargrove was already making notes. And Damian sat at the table and looked at the space where the federal folder had been and breathed. Elena pushed back her chair and stood. She was moving toward the door when Damian said her name. She stopped. You've been building that cooperation for 4 months, he said. That's why Reyes's position is what it is today. That's why your name is addressable. He looked at her. You protected yourself. You protected this. He stopped. You protected the family. Before you knew whether there was going to be one. Elena stood at the door with her hand on the frame, the same position she'd been in yesterday morning, in the kitchen, when Marcus had walked in and the day had started its long, terrible accumulation. I protected what I could protect, she said, with what I had available. She looked at him. Same as I've always done. She went upstairs. He sat at the table for another minute. Then his phone rang. Marcus. His voice was clipped, the surgical register. Carrera's moving, he said. We just got word from Delgado, one of his network contacts in the south. Carrera's pulling back, dissolving the operation that ran the compound attack, moving assets. He's running, Damian said. Running or repositioning. He knows the federal attention just shifted to him. The tip he had Brennan plant, it's blowing back on him. His own name is in some of the documentation Brennan submitted, and he didn't know that. Brennan played both sides. Marcus paused. Damian, there's something else. He waited. Carrera's man, Freitas, the operations coordinator who ran Torres. Freitas just reached out, to us, directly, through a channel he shouldn't have been able to access. Marcus's voice went very careful. He wants a conversation. He says he has information about who inside the compound provided access beyond Torres. He says Torres wasn't the only one. The dining room table was very still under his hands. He's offering information in exchange for what? Positioning. He sees the direction Carrera's operation is going and he wants out before it lands on him. A pause. He says the second source inside the compound, the one who provided Carrera with the psychological profile, the information about Celeste being here, who designed the split decision scenario, wasn't Torres. Damian's jaw tightened. He says it was someone Carrera brought in specifically for this operation, someone who has been inside your life longer than the compound. Marcus said it very carefully. He won't give the name without a conversation. Set it up. It needs to be today. Freitas is moving by tonight. Then set it up for this afternoon. Neutral location. Your choice. Damian stood. And Marcus, verify everything he gives us through a second channel before we act on any of it. I'm done trusting single sources. Copy. He hung up. He stood in the empty dining room. The afternoon light was coming through the windows now, the specific flat light of a day that had been overcast since before sunrise and wasn't going to resolve into anything cleaner. His compound was damaged. His organization was under federal scrutiny. His CFO of 14 years had sold him to a rival family and the federal government simultaneously. 3 of his men were dead. And somewhere in his life, not in his organization, in his life, there was still a thread that Carrera had gotten hold of, and he didn't know which thread it was. He went to find Elena. She wasn't upstairs. She wasn't in the library. He found her in the east corridor, standing at the edge of where the destroyed wall opened onto the courtyard. The cleanup crew had cleared the debris, but the wall itself was still open, a raw gap with exposed rebar and crumbled stone on either side, and she was standing at the edge of it, looking out at the courtyard, at the fountain, still running, still going in its small circle. Freitas reached out, he said, coming to stand beside her, not touching. Carrera's operations man. He says there's a second source inside my life, beyond Torres. Someone who built the psychological profile, Saya, who knew about Celeste, who designed the scenario. She was quiet. The wind came through the gap in the wall, cold. He won't give the name without a meeting. Do you trust him? I trust that he's trying to save himself, and this is his currency. Damian looked at the fountain. That's a calculable motivation. When? This afternoon. She nodded slowly. Then, the psychological profile. The person who knew about Celeste. She said it without particular emphasis. Who knew about Celeste being here, from your side, before Torres? He thought about it. I handled most of the arrangements directly. Torres coordinated the logistics. There was... He stopped. Who? Her voice was quiet, but very direct. When Celeste's visit was arranged, I called ahead to have the suite prepared. I spoke to one person about the scheduling. He went very still. My assistant, Donna Graves. She's been with the household for, 7 years, Elena said. He looked at her. Donna's been with the household for 7 years, Elena said. She has access to every scheduling decision that runs through this house. Family appointments, household logistics, personal calendar. She paused. She arranged the flowers when I miscarried in 2019. She knows what suite Celeste was put in because she ordered the room to be prepared. She knows the household layout better than most of your security team. He looked at his wife. You suspected Donna. I've had an uncomfortable feeling about Donna for 3 months, Elena said. I couldn't point to anything specific. It was more... She stopped. She started asking questions that weren't her job. Small things. Who was visiting? What the schedule looked like. Questions she already should have known the answers to, if she'd been paying attention, like she was confirming things rather than learning them. You didn't tell me. I didn't have anything concrete. You told me about Brennan. When you had a feeling about Brennan, I told a federal agent about Brennan, she said, with a look that was precise enough to cut, because I had enough to build a case. I didn't have enough on Donna. A feeling isn't evidence. He turned that over. He thought about Donna Graves, 53 years old, 7 years in the household, efficient and quiet, and the kind of person who organized his life's administrative details so thoroughly that he'd stopped noticing she was there. The kind of person you stopped seeing. The kind of presence that becomes invisible through sheer consistency. The best kind of source. I need to call Marcus, he said. Call Marcus. He stepped away from the gap in the wall and made the call. Told Marcus to pull everything on Donna Graves and to do it without alerting her, and to find out where she was right now, because she would have known this morning what last night's events were and what the federal meeting meant, and a woman in that position would be calculating her next move. Marcus called back in 6 minutes. She's not on property, he said. She called in sick this morning. First sick day she's taken in 2 years. Of course. She's running, Damian said, or she's waiting to see how the federal meeting went before she decides which direction to run. Marcus's voice was tight. Damian, if Donna is Carrera's second source, if she's the one who built the psychological profile that engineered last night, then she's been inside your household, your personal household. She knows things that... I know what she knows, Marcus. A silence. Freitas, Damian said. Move the meeting up, as soon as possible. I need the confirmation. I'm already on it. 2 hours. Warehouse on the industrial strip south of town. Neutral. I've used it before. I'll be there. He hung up. He stood in the corridor for a moment, feeling the shape of what he was walking toward. He turned back to the gap in the wall, where Elena was still standing. Stay here, he said. Don't go anywhere without 2 men. Don't speak to Donna if she contacts you. I know how this works. I know you do. He paused. Elena, if this goes the way I think it goes, then handle it. After today, when this is done, I want to have a real conversation. Not a crisis conversation. A real one. She looked at him. The afternoon light on her face was the same flat gray as the sky, and in it she looked like the woman he had married, and also like a woman he was only beginning to understand. And those were the same person, and that was the thing he'd somehow missed for 8 months. We'll see what's left to talk about, she said. Not unkindly, just honestly. He went to get his jacket. The warehouse was 40 minutes south in an industrial stretch between 2 freight yards where the road turned from asphalt to gravel, and the buildings were the color of old rust. Marcus was already there when Damian arrived, with 2 men positioned outside and a third at the interior door. The warehouse was empty, except for a folding table and 4 chairs, and the cold smell of concrete and motor oil. Freitas was already inside. He was younger than Damian expected. Mid-40s, lean, with the careful stillness of a man who had spent years in rooms where the wrong movement got you killed. He had a laptop bag over one shoulder and his hands were visible, and he stood up when Damian came in without making it look like deference, which told Damian something about how Freitas saw this negotiation. Mr. Voss, Freitas said. Damian sat across from him. Marcus stood to the right. Carrera is burning everything, Freitas said. Last night was supposed to be a contained operation. Take out your compound security, plant the federal documentation, create enough chaos that you'd spend the next 6 months defending yourself instead of operating. Clean, surgical. He paused. It went larger than planned because Torres over-executed on the breach. Carrera's furious. The federal attention he's now getting, that wasn't part of his model. His model included Brennan, Damian said. Brennan came to Carrera. Not the other way around. Carrera used what Brennan offered, but Brennan was his own initiative. Freitas set the bag on the table. The psychological operation, the split decision design, the information about Miss Marlowe, the scenario engineering, that was separate from Brennan. That was someone else. Donna Graves. Freitas looked at him. The look was confirmation, and it also held something that was almost respect. The specific kind you develop for people who get there before you expected them to. She came to Carrera 14 months ago, Freitas said. Through a referral from a man in his network who knew her from before she was working your household. She'd been in your household for 6 years by then. She had significant intelligence value. What was she offering? Behavioral profiling. Your patterns, your responses to specific stimuli, your relationships and how they functioned under stress. Freitas opened the bag and slid a folder across the table, including a detailed profile of your dynamic with Miss Marlowe and with Mrs. Voss, including the assessment that the introduction of a specific kind of pressure, a threat that required you to choose between them physically, in real time, would create a fracture in your organization that no external attack could create on its own. He paused. She was right. Damian opened the folder. The document inside was typed, professional, detailed. His name at the top. Below it, a portrait. Not of his financials or his operations, but of his psychology, his decision patterns, his pressure points. The specific architecture of the fault line in his marriage described in the language of an intelligence assessment. He read 3 pages of it. His jaw was very tight. She profiled me, he said, for 14 months. And she gave this to Carrera. She sold it, monthly updates. She was well compensated. Freitas's voice was neutral. Last night was the field test of the assessment. Damian closed the folder. He set it flat on the table and placed both hands on it and breathed through his nose for a measured moment. "Where is she?" he said. "She left the compound this morning. She's at a property in the next county, a rental, not in her name. She's waiting for confirmation that the federal meeting this morning didn't create additional exposure for her. If she determines it's clean, she'll move to a new position in Carrera's network." Freitas slid a second piece of paper across the table. "An address." "She doesn't know I'm here." Damian looked at the address. "What do you want?" he said. "Carrera's organization is going down," Freitas said. "Not maybe. It's going down. The federal exposure from last night, combined with what Brennan submitted, Carrera miscalculated the blowback, and now it's moving faster than he can manage. I want to be demonstrably not part of that when it lands." He held Damian's gaze. "I want to be able to testify, if it comes to that I cooperated with your organization, against Carrera, in a way that's documented and witnessed." "You want cover?" "I want a future." Damian studied his face, calculated, weighed the specific reliability of a man who was saving himself against the specific reliability of the information he'd provided, and whether one contaminated the other. "The information in this folder," Damian said, "if I corroborate it independently." "You will. The rental property is confirmed. Donna Graves is there. The monthly payments to her are in Carrera's financial records, which I have copies of." He tapped the laptop bag. "Everything I've told you is verifiable." "Then you'll have your documentation," Damian said. "When it's done." He stood. He took the folder and the address. Outside, in the cold air by the car, Marcus fell into step beside him and said nothing for a moment. "Donna," Marcus said finally. "Yes." 7 years. "Yes." Marcus processed that in the way he processed things, quickly, without visible emotion, moving directly to the operational layer. "How do you want to handle it?" Damian got in the car. He held the address in his hand. A property in the next county. A woman who had spent 7 years learning the architecture of his life and had spent 14 months selling it. He thought about what she'd written, the fault line analysis, the prediction that a physical choice, made in real time, under fire, would fracture the marriage and destabilize the organization simultaneously. The precision of it, the accuracy of it. She'd been right. It had worked. The choice he'd made in those 3 seconds on the second floor had done exactly what the assessment predicted it would do. He'd been profiled, studied, and he had performed exactly as predicted. That was the thing that sat worst, not the betrayal. He'd had enough betrayals to have built a working relationship with them. What sat worst was the accuracy. The degree to which someone sitting in his house for 7 years, watching him move through his life, had understood him better than he understood himself. "I'm going to her," he said. Marcus looked at him. "Alone. With you. 2 men." He looked at the address. "This ends today." The drive took 40 minutes. It was almost 4 p.m. when they arrived at the rental property, a small house at the end of a gravel driveway off a county road, surrounded by bare trees. A single car in the drive. Lights in the front window. Damian got out. He walked to the front door. He could feel Marcus behind him, the 2 men flanking. He didn't reach for a weapon. He wasn't going to need one. Donna Graves was not that kind of threat. Her power had never been physical. It had been proximity. It had been patience. It had been the precise, slow accumulation of access. He knocked. A pause. Then the sound of movement inside. The kind of hesitation that precedes a decision. Then the door opened. Donna Graves was in civilian clothes. Not household clothes, not the professional presentation she wore at the compound. She was in jeans and a coat, and her gray streaked hair was down, and she looked at Damian with the expression of a woman who had prepared herself for this moment and found, now that it was here, that preparation wasn't the same as readiness. She held his gaze. "How long did you know I'd come?" he said. Her chin lifted a fraction. "Since about noon," she said, "when Freitas didn't make contact. You knew he'd come to me." "I suspected." She stepped back from the door. Not inviting him in, simply creating space, the automatic gesture of a woman who had spent 7 years managing household space. "He's been looking for an exit for 6 months. You were the obvious door." Damian stepped inside. Marcus stayed at the threshold. The rental was sparse: a table, a laptop, 2 bags packed and standing by the back wall. A woman who had been ready to move and had been waiting for the right signal. "The profile," he said. He held up the folder. "You wrote this." She looked at it. "Yes." 14 months. 15, she said. "The first month I was still deciding. And then you decided. And then I decided." Her voice was controlled, but there was something in it. Not guilt, exactly. Something that was related to guilt, but had been processed through too many months of justification to still be called that cleanly. "You're a very predictable man, Mr. Voss, in specific ways. The ways that matter. The choice I made on the second floor was exactly what the assessment projected." She didn't say it with satisfaction. She said it with the flat accuracy of someone reporting a result. "I want you to know that I understood what I was doing. I'm not going to tell you I didn't know it would affect Mrs. Voss. I knew." The room temperature didn't change. Damian's face didn't change. But something in the quality of the air between them shifted in a way that made Donna Graves take one step back without choosing to. "You spent 7 years in my home," he said. "Yes." "You ate dinner with my family." "Yes." "You sent flowers when Elena miscarried." Something finally moved across her face, the first fracture in the controlled surface. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a specific tension at the corner of the mouth. But it was there. "You wrote a document that described my wife as a pressure point," Damian said. "You gave that document to the man who blew out my wall and killed 3 of my people and put Elena in a dark corridor alone, 8 months pregnant, with no men on her door." His voice had descended to the place below quiet. "And then this morning, you called in sick." Donna Graves stood very still. Outside, through the window, the bare trees moved in the wind. The light was failing, late afternoon going to early evening, the sky a darkening gray. Somewhere down the county road, a truck moved past, its engine a brief intrusion, and then gone. "The federal investigation is going to reach you," Damian said. "Freitas has documentation of your arrangement with Carrera, payment records, communication logs. That will go to Reyes's office by end of day." He paused. "What happens after that is a question of what you do in the next hour." She looked at him. "What are my options?" "You can cooperate with the federal investigation fully, provide testimony about Carrera's operational structure, your role, Freitas's role. In exchange for that cooperation, you'll have legal counsel and whatever consideration the federal prosecutors decide your testimony is worth." He held her gaze. "Or you can run, and I'll find you. And the second time we have this conversation will not be in a rental house." It was not a theatrical threat. It was a logistical statement, delivered in the tone of a man discussing a schedule. Donna Graves understood the difference. She sat down at the table. Her hands were flat on its surface, the same gesture Torres had made in the basement. The universal position of a person who has run out of moves and is stopping to take stock of what remains. "I'll cooperate," she said, "with everything." "With everything?" "Including a full account of the information you provided Carrera and how you collected it." "Yes." He nodded. He looked at her for one more moment, at this woman who had been in his house for 7 years and had, in a specific sense, known him better than most of the people he trusted. And he felt something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, and settled somewhere between them in a place that had no clean name. "Marcus will stay with you," he said, "until your attorney arrives." He left the house. The drive back to the compound took 40 minutes in the darkening afternoon, and he drove it himself this time, Marcus staying behind with Donna Graves and 2 men. The road was empty. The industrial stretch gave way to the main road, and the main road gave way to the approach to his property, and the compound lights came on in the gathering dark the way they always did, automated, indifferent to what had happened inside them. He parked. He sat in the car for a moment. He had found the breach. He had found all of it. Torres, Brennan, Donna Graves, the 3 points of a triangle that had been constructed around his life with patience and precision over 14 months. He had addressed it. He had done the thing he was built for, which was to identify the threat and move toward it and neutralize it with the controlled efficiency that had kept him alive and operational through 17 years of this work. And it had worked. The investigation was contained. The threats were addressed. Carrera was burning. He sat in the car and felt none of the things he expected to feel. What he felt was the specific weight of a man who has won a battle that was entirely the wrong battle, who has been so focused on the threats around the perimeter that he has only now, sitting in a car in his own driveway with the lights of his compound in front of him, begun to fully face the damage at the center. He went inside. He went upstairs. He walked to the room where Elena was staying, and he knocked, and she said, "Come in," and he opened the door. And she was sitting on the edge of the bed with the secondary phone in her hands again, the same position as the first night, and she looked up at him and read his face and waited. "Donna Graves," he said. 7 years, working for Carrera for 15 months. She built the profile. She designed the scenario. He stood in the doorway. "She's cooperating with federal investigators as of this evening." Elena held his gaze. Something moved through her expression. Not surprised, the way you're not surprised when a thing you felt turned out to be real. "It's done," he said. She nodded. "Elena." He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood in the center of it and looked at his wife and said the thing that had been building in him since the shelter, since the corridor, since the library, since 3 a.m. on the highway, when the shape of what she'd actually been doing rearranged everything he thought he understood. "I chose wrong. Not just the corridor, not just last night. I've been choosing wrong for—" He stopped. "For long enough that you built an exit and a federal cooperation deal because you didn't know if I was the person who would protect you when it came to it." She was very still on the edge of the bed. "You were right not to know," he said. "I hadn't given you a reason to know." The room was quiet. The compound outside was going through its evening routines, the shift change, the patrol, the small procedural sounds of a damaged organization trying to maintain its rhythm. The fountain was still running. He could hear it faintly through the window. "Damian," Elena said. He looked at her. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She looked at him for a long time. She looked at his hands, and she looked at his face, and she breathed in and breathed out in the measured way she'd been doing since the first explosion, the way that meant she was managing the size of something. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," she said. "I know. And I'm not going to tell you I'm done." He looked up. "I'm telling you I'm not done," she said. Her voice was very quiet. And underneath the quiet was something that was not warmth exactly, but was the precondition of warmth. The choice, deliberate, made under no illusions to not close the door. But what that means is going to depend on what comes next, not what you say, what you do. He looked at her, at the woman who had spent 4 months building a case against the man who was betraying them both, who had stood in a corridor alone at midnight and put on her shoes and made her own way to the shelter, who had sat across from a federal agent this morning and been precise and controlled and had protected the life they'd built even when she wasn't sure the man she built it with was worth protecting. "I know," he said. Outside, the fountain ran. The compound held its shape against the dark. And in a room upstairs, 2 people who had been dismantling and rebuilding the architecture of their trust for 11 years sat in the particular silence of a moment that had not yet become what it was going to become, waiting to... He sat, not at the edge of the chair, not in the forward lean of a man ready to move. He sat back, in the center of it, and let the weight of himself settle into it the way he hadn't let himself settle into anything in months. Maybe longer. Elena watched him do it. She watched the specific way his shoulders dropped, not in defeat, in something more like the release of a held breath that had been held so long the body had forgotten it was doing it. She watched his hands move from his knees to the armrests and then come to rest there, open, palms up, which was not a position she had seen his hands take in a very long time. Outside, the fountain ran its small circle in the dark. "The profile she wrote," Elena said. "Did you read it?" 3 pages. "What did it say about me?" He looked at her directly. "That you were the stabilizing architecture of the organization, whether either of us acknowledged it or not. That removing your confidence in me would be the most efficient way to create structural collapse." He paused. "She wasn't wrong." Elena was quiet for a moment. "She understood what you didn't." "Yes." "For 7 years she watched you not understand it." "Yes." He didn't look away. "And she sold that understanding to a man who used it to kill 3 of my people and put you alone in a corridor at midnight." His jaw moved. "I've been thinking about that. About the fact that my failure to see clearly became a weapon that someone else picked up and used." Elena looked at her hands. At the secondary phone she was still holding, the one she'd memorized the number on, the one she'd carried through the shelter and the library and every room of this compound for the past 2 days, like a talisman that represented the version of her life in which she'd made a different decision. She set it on the nightstand. She set it down with the specific deliberateness of a person making a choice in real time, not announcing it, just doing it, the way she did most things. Damian watched her set it down. Neither of them said anything about it. "The deposition," she said. "Park says 4 to 6 weeks before they schedule it formally. Hargrove thinks we're through the worst of the federal exposure. Brennan's cooperation plus Donna's testimony, it redirects the investigation toward Carrera's network. We're peripheral." "We're not peripheral. We're just less useful as targets than Carrera." "That's what peripheral means in federal terms." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it occupied the same space one would, and Damian felt it like something physical in the center of his chest. "The organization," she said. "What happens to it?" He took a breath. "It contracts. We shed the parts of it that require the kind of exposure we've been carrying. The shell structures that Brennan built, we dismantle them properly, with counsel, in a way that documents the process. We get smaller." He paused. "We get cleaner." "Cleaner?" "I've been running something for 17 years that required me to maintain a specific kind of complexity, a specific kind of opacity." He looked at the window, at the dark. "The opacity is what let Torres happen, let Brennan happen. Let Donna Graves sit at my kitchen table for 7 years and learn the geography of my blind spots." He looked back at her. "I don't know how to run something clean. I've never done it. But I know that what I've been doing it's not survivable, long term. It's not a thing you can do forever and keep the things that matter." Elena held his gaze for a long moment. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 8 months, she said. He didn't argue with the timeline. "I know," he said. She shifted on the edge of the bed. Her hand went to her stomach, the automatic movement, the one he'd been watching for 2 days, and she pressed her palm flat against the side and held it there. Her face changed slightly. Something attentive moved across it. "She's moving," Elena said. "She. We don't know that, but I've been calling the baby she for 3 weeks, in my head." She looked at him. "You didn't know that?" "No." "There are a lot of things you don't know," she said. Not with accusation, with the simple factual weight of a woman who has been carrying a private interior life for months, because the person she'd usually share it with had been elsewhere in every way that mattered. "Tell me," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "Tell me. Not right now. Not all of it right now. But I want to know. The things in the margins that I've been—" He stopped. "I've been inside my own—" Another stop. He was not a man who struggled for words. He struggled now. "I stopped paying attention to the right things. I want to pay attention again." Elena looked at her husband in the yellow light of a room that wasn't her room, in a compound that had a blown-out wall and 3 graves being arranged and a federal investigation threading through its history like a needle. She looked at the gray in his stubble and the specific exhaustion around his eyes and the open position of his hands on the armrests, and she thought about 11 years and what 11 years actually meant, not the romantic version, not the terrible version, but the real version, which was that it meant knowing a person at a depth that no one else on earth reached, knowing their worst choices and their best ones, and the gap between who they intended to be and who they were when the pressure was on. She knew him at that depth. She'd known him there since before he had anything, since before the empire and the compound and the men who moved out of his path. She'd known him when he was a man with a plan and a specific quality of hunger and nothing else. And she had decided then that the man was worth the risk. She was still deciding that. Every day was still that decision. "The baby's room," she said. "I've been planning it in my head for 2 months. Colors, furniture layout, how the light comes in at different times of day." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure if there was going to be a version of our life where we'd be in the same house when she arrived." Damian sat with that. He let it land where it was heavy, which was everywhere. "I want to know about the room," he said. She told him. Quietly, in the late evening stillness of the compound, she described the room she'd been building in her head, the pale color she wanted on the walls. Not white, something with more warmth, something that would hold the morning light from the east window. The furniture layout, the specific kind of light fixture she'd seen in a catalog 3 months ago and had closed the catalog without ordering because it had felt like tempting something. She described it all with the contained, precise language she used for things she cared about most, and he listened without interrupting, without offering opinions, just listened and let her build the room in the air between them. When she finished, there was a quiet that was different in quality from all the other quiets of the past 2 days. "Order the fixture," he said. She looked at him. "The light fixture. Order it." She pressed her lips together. Something moved behind her eyes. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried through any of this, not once, and she didn't now. But the pressure of the thing she wasn't crying was visible in the particular steadiness with which she held her face. "Get some sleep," she said. "You've been awake for 36 hours. He stood. He moved toward the door. "Damian!" He stopped. She had her hand on her stomach again, and she was looking at the space in front of her rather than at him, which was the position she took when she was saying something that required not watching his reaction. "I'm not saying everything is fixed," she said. "I need you to know that. I'm not... The thing that happened in the corridor, the 3 seconds, that's not... I'm not going to pretend that's not what it was. I know. But I'm also not saying it's over." She looked up then, met his eyes. "I'm saying it's not over. Which is not the same as saying it's fine. It means there's work to do, and I'm willing to do the work if you're..." She stopped. "If you're actually in it, not managing it, in it." "I'm in it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, testing the weight of those 3 words, whether they held. Then she nodded, just once, and turned back to the dark window and the garden beyond it. He went to his room and he slept for the first time in 36 hours, and the sleep was deep and without dreams. 3 weeks passed. Then 4. The deposition was scheduled and then rescheduled and then conducted on a gray Thursday morning in a conference room in the Federal Building downtown, with Hargrove on one side and Park on the other, and Agent Reyes at the opposite end of the table, with 2 colleagues and a court reporter who typed everything in that rapid, silent way that made every word feel like it was being pressed into permanence. Damian talked for 6 hours. He talked about Brennan and the structures he'd built and the authorizations he'd provided and the operational decisions that were his and the ones that weren't. He talked about Torres. He talked about what he'd known and when and what he'd failed to know and why. And that last part was the hardest, not because he didn't have the words, but because the words required him to describe, in a federal setting, the specific texture of his own inattention, the ways he had been looking in the wrong direction for long enough that the people looking in the right direction had been able to work unobserved. Reyes listened to all of it with the careful face of a professional who understood that the man across from her was giving her more than she'd expected and was doing it without performance, and that this fact was information. At 4 p.m., she closed her notebook. "Mr. Voss," she said. "For the record, the Carrera indictments came down this morning. 18 counts across 4 defendants. Freitas's cooperation was substantial." "I know," he said. "Donna Graves has accepted a plea arrangement. Her testimony is complete." "I know that too." Reyes looked at him across the conference table. The Voss organization is not a target of this investigation. I want that stated clearly on the record. She paused. That doesn't mean it's invisible to us. It means that for the purposes of this inquiry, you're a cooperative witness whose interests have been aligned with the federal interest in dismantling the Carrera network. I understand the distinction. Good. She stood. Her team stood. At the door she turned, and she did the things she'd done at the compound, the off-script moment, the brief departure from the professional register. Mrs. Voss, how is she? Damian looked at the woman across the room and felt something that was specific and uncomplicated in a way that almost nothing else in his life was. She's well, he said. The baby's due in 9 days. Reyes's face did something small and human. Good luck, she said. She left. Hargrove was talking before the door closed. Next steps, reporting requirements, the structure of the ongoing cooperation agreement, and Damian sat and listened and nodded at the right moments and moved through the rest of the afternoon on the procedural momentum of a thing that was ending. He drove back to the compound himself. The wall had been rebuilt, not the original stone, which had been too damaged to salvage, but new stone, the same pale color, matched carefully enough that you had to know where to look to see the seam. You could still see the seam if you looked. He didn't think that was a problem. He thought it was probably appropriate. Elena was in the kitchen when he came in, not standing at the counter looking out at the courtyard this time. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a legal pad covered in handwriting, and she looked up when he came in with the expression of a woman who had learned to read his face's specific vocabulary and was doing so now. Done, he said. She nodded. Reyes? Professional, thorough, done. He got coffee. He sat across from her. He looked at the legal pad. What is that? She turned it toward him. It was a list, organized, detailed in her precise handwriting, of the shell structures remaining in the Voss financial architecture, with notations next to each one indicating which could be dissolved cleanly and which required more complex unwinding and which needed counsel before any action was taken. He looked at it for a moment. You mapped the dissolution, he said. Park and I worked through it yesterday. He agrees with the assessment. She pulled the pad back. The Calder structure is the most complicated. The others are addressable in the next 60 to 90 days. You didn't have to do this. She looked at him with the expression she used when he said something she found mildly absurd. I'm a signatory on 3 of these structures. I have a functional interest in their orderly dissolution. You have a baby due in 9 days. I can still do math. She picked up her tea. Park is setting up a meeting for next week, if you're available. I'm available. She nodded, looked back at the legal pad. Then, without looking up, Carrera indictments came down this morning. How did you know? Marcus texted me. He looked at her. Marcus texts you. Marcus has been texting me for 2 years. He texts me when things happen that he thinks I should know about and that he's not sure will make it to me through you. She said it without heat, still looking at the legal pad. He was right to do that. Damian sat with that. He thought about Marcus, about 20 years of the man's steady presence, the surgical efficiency, the care with which he'd been managing the gap between what Damian was paying attention to and what he should have been, quietly, without being asked. The same way Elena had been managing things, on her own front, for months. He'd been surrounded by people doing the work he wasn't doing. I'm going to have a conversation with Marcus, he said, a real one, about what his role is and what it should be going forward. Elena looked up. He's been your second for 11 years. He's been doing more than second work for at least 2 of those years. That needs to be acknowledged and compensated appropriately. He held her gaze. People who do the real work should know that it's seen. Something in Elena's expression shifted. Small, but he saw it because he was paying attention, because he had decided to pay attention, and attention was a practice, not a state, and he was practicing. That's a different way of talking, she said. I'm working on it. The corner of her mouth moved. I noticed. He reached across the table, not to take her hand, just to place his hand on the table beside hers. Open, palm down, present. She looked at it. Then she put her hand on top of his. They sat like that in the kitchen while the evening came on. The baby arrived on a Tuesday, not with any of the precision that Elena had applied to everything else over the past months, not on schedule, not according to plan, not in any of the organized ways she might have preferred. She woke at 4 a.m. with the specific feeling that things had shifted, and by 4:30 she was clear on what was happening, and she walked to Damian's room herself and knocked, and told him they needed to go. He was out of bed and dressed, and at the door with the car keys in 40 seconds. She noted that. She filed it. They drove to the hospital in the dark, through the same industrial stretch, and the same county roads they'd been moving through for days. And this time the drive had a completely different quality of silence. Not the silence of damage or distance or managed pain, but the silence of two people sitting with something larger than either of them, something that had been building for 9 months and was now in the process of arriving. He did not make calls. He did not check his phone. He drove. At the hospital, he stayed in the room. He'd asked her the week before whether she wanted him there. What? Asked it without assumption, without the expectation that the answer was obvious. She'd looked at him for a moment and said yes, and that yes had been as specific and weighted as any word she'd said in months. He stayed. He was not good at it. He did not know what to do with his hands, and he stood in the wrong places and got moved by nurses twice. And at one point Elena looked at him from the bed in the middle of something difficult, and he was standing there with the specific helpless expression of a man who has been competent in every other room of his life and has arrived in the one room where competence means nothing, and she looked at him and said through clenched teeth, "Come here." He came. He took her hand. He held it. That was what he did for the next 4 hours. The child arrived at 9:22 in the morning, in the specific way of new things arriving, with noise and urgency and a kind of raw physical reality that made everything else in the room seem distant and thin. A girl, 7 pounds 4 ounces, screaming with what appeared to be justified indignation at the abruptness of her new situation. Damian stood at the side of the bed and held his daughter for the first time, and she was small in a way that was beyond his frame of reference for small, and she had her eyes closed and her fists clenched and her face arranged in the aggressive displeasure of someone who had opinions about her circumstances. And he stood with her against his chest and felt something move through him that had no name in the vocabulary he'd been using for 17 years. Elena watched his face. She watched him understand what he was holding. She watched the understanding arrive not as thought, but as physical fact, in the way his arms adjusted without being told, in the way his whole body oriented toward the child with an instinct that bypassed everything else. She watched the man she knew at the deepest level available finally arrive in the right room. "She's not afraid of anything," Damian said. He was looking at his daughter's clenched fists. "She's 3 minutes old," Elena said. "She hasn't had time to develop fears." "She'll learn." He looked up. "We'll teach her the useful ones." Elena held out her arms, and he placed the baby back, carefully, with the specific care of someone who has decided that careful is now the operative mode. He sat in the chair beside the bed. They stayed like that for a while. The three of them, in the particular quiet of a morning in a hospital room, with the ordinary sounds of the building around them and the window showing a sky that had finally, after days of gray, gone to something approaching clear. "The room," Elena said. She meant the baby's room. "The color I chose. I need to actually order the paint." "I already ordered it," he said. She looked at him. "Last week. Park had the catalog." He paused. "I ordered the light fixture, too." She was quiet for a moment. The baby made a small sound and settled. "You didn't tell me," Elena said. "I wanted to see if you noticed." He looked at her. "Whether something being done matched you expecting it to be done." She understood what he was saying, that he had been practicing the specific act of doing without announcing, of choosing without being watched, of being the person who showed up when there was no one in the corridor to witness it. She looked at him for a long time. "I noticed," she said. He nodded. Outside, the day moved on in its ordinary way. Traffic on the street below, voices in the corridor, the small procedural sounds of a world that continued regardless. Marcus texted at 11 to say that the legal paperwork for the first shell dissolution had been filed. Park texted at noon to confirm the meeting for the following week. Hargrove sent a brief message that was almost cheerful by his standards. Investigation moving in the right direction. No further action required on their end for the foreseeable future. Damian read the messages. He sent brief responses. He put the phone in his pocket. The compound, when they returned to it 4 days later, looked different to him. He'd been trying to identify why since the deposition, and he understood it now, standing in the front approach with Elena beside him and the baby in the carrier she'd chosen, the specific pale yellow carrier that she'd ordered 3 months ago and that had sat in the closet unopened. The compound looked like what it was. A large, well-maintained property with a repaired wall and a running fountain and a security team that had been restructured twice in 2 weeks and was now smaller and more carefully selected. It looked like a house, not a fortress, not an empire, a house where people lived. Marcus was at the door. He shook Damian's hand and looked at the baby with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things in his career and finds this specific thing genuinely beyond his professional frame of reference. "She looks like Elena," he said. "Good," Damian said. "That's good for her." Marcus almost smiled. He held the door. Elena walked inside first into the house she had built and nearly left and had spent 4 months quietly fighting for, and she moved through it with the specific authority of a woman who has made her decision and is not revisiting it. She went to the kitchen, she put the kettle on, she stood at the counter and looked out at the courtyard at the fountain still going in its small circle, and she laughed once, a short, real, unsentimental sound. "We need to turn that off," she said when Damian came in. "Probably." "Not today." "Not today," he agreed. He stood beside her at the counter, not at the same distance as 2 days ago, or a week ago, or the distance of 8 months. Closer. The distance of two people who had come back from a significant remove and were still calibrating, still finding the right proximity, but no longer pretending the calibration wasn't happening. The kettle boiled. She made tea. She made him coffee. She set his cup on the counter without ceremony and picked up her own, and they stood in the kitchen of the house they had almost lost and watched the fountain run and held their cups and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said right then. The baby slept in the carrier between them. Outside, the sun was doing something specific with the light on the rebuilt wall, catching the seam between the old stone and the new, tracing it, making it visible in a way that would fade as the stone weathered and settled and became indistinguishable from what had been there before. In a year, you wouldn't see the seam. In 2 years, it would be gone entirely. But right now it was there, visible, honest about what it was. That seemed right to Damian. He stood in his kitchen and drank his coffee and looked at the seam in the wall and thought about what he'd spent 17 years building and what it had cost and what he was willing to pay going forward and what he wasn't. He thought about Torres in the basement and Brennan in the hotel room and Donna Graves at the rental house, about all the things he'd believed were settled that turned out not to be. He thought about 3 seconds in a corridor and the direction an instinct had pointed and what it had cost. He thought about Elena walking herself to the shelter at midnight in his too big shirt with her hand on her stomach, and the secondary phone in her pocket and a number she'd memorized for exactly the kind of night that it turned out to be. He thought about her not using it the way he expected, about the different kind of fight she'd chosen instead. He set the coffee cup down. "Elena," he said. She turned to look at him. "I know this isn't fixed," he said. "I know we're—" He stopped. "I know the work is ahead of us. I know you're not going to take my word for any of it, and you shouldn't. I know the last 8 months happened, and they don't unhappen." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to pretend they didn't." She waited. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not because it's easier, not because of the organization or the house or any of that. Because I want—" He stopped again, and again he was not a man who struggled for words, and again the struggle was visible, because the word he was looking for was the kind that his vocabulary had been systematically avoiding for 8 months and he was out of practice with it. "Because I want to be the person who shows up in the right corridor at the right time, without thinking about it." He looked at her directly. "I want to be someone you don't have to build a backup plan for." The kitchen was quiet. The baby made a small sleeping sound. Elena looked at him. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 11 years. All the way down to the level where the versions of him lived, The one before the Empire, and the one after, and the one he was standing in right now, trying to build something new out of what remained. She put her tea down. She took a step forward and she put both her hands flat against his chest. Not an embrace. Something more direct, more specific. The gesture of a woman who is checking whether something is still there. He put one hand over hers. The same open position, palm down, present. "Don't waste it," she said. Just that. Not a promise, not a pardon, not a romantic declaration. A condition, offered by a woman who knew exactly what she was worth and had decided, with full information, to give the man in front of her the chance to prove he knew it too. "I won't," he said. She stepped back. She picked up her tea. She turned to look back out the window at the courtyard and the fountain and the rebuilt wall and the seam that was visible now but wouldn't be forever. He stood beside her. The baby slept. The fountain ran. The light moved across the stone in the particular way of late morning, unhurried, indifferent to what had happened in its path, doing only what light does, filling the spaces, finding the cracks, making visible what was there.